as I'm standing up here, I can only think like, wow, they messed up and asked me to come speak at the summit, right? Fair warning to everybody out there, if Chaplain Kitchens comes to your location and you pretend like you know what you're talking about, you can be up here too, right? Man, as we talk spiritual fitness and we talk moral injury and how that aligns with the LOEs, I'm passionate about where we can go with that. And so I'm not smart on all of this. I happen to be around smart people, and so I'm thankful to be connected to people like Chaplain Albertson. And with Chaplain Albertson, you look at somebody who's been in over 30 years, and he's been in the foxhole with soldiers who have had bullets flying overhead. And he's been at the highest levels and advising multiple 4-star commanders. You talk about somebody who's been in the game and knows what spiritual fitness is and what moral injury is. He's lived it and he knows it. And I've learned a lot from him. And I look at people like Dr. J.E. Catterson, J.E. Well-educated, well-connected. He could be doing anything in the world that he wanted to. He's that gifted and that equipped. And he chooses to invest in the Chaplain Corps. And he chooses to be smart in areas like moral injury, and he chooses to equip us to make us better at our profession because he loves what we do, and he loves ministry. And so I'm thankful to have them and to represent Special Operations Command and Joint Special Operations University. Now, everything we're going to talk about today is built on 2 premises. The first premise is this: everybody is spiritual. And we talked about that earlier. There's a chaplain who I love who put it this way. When he's talking about everybody is spiritual, he said, the greatest theologian is a man by the name of Mick Jagger, right? And when he said that, I stopped. And I was confused. And I was like, well, maybe that's a Presbyterian thing. I've never heard that before. But he went on and he said, what is Mick Jagger's most famous song? I can't get no satisfaction, right? And he said that's a deeply spiritual song. And when you think about it, there's some truth to that. Mick Jagger had all the fame you could ever ask for. He had all the money you could ask for. Anything Mick Jagger wanted, he could have. And in America, we would say he is the epitome of success. And yet his hit song was he wasn't satisfied by that. So what is it? That's spirituality. And so this chaplain who I love, I won't name him, but he said everybody craves 4 things: love, joy, peace, and significance. That's spirituality. You're talking purpose, value, meanings, and beliefs. That's what all that wraps into. It doesn't matter what faith you are. We are all spiritual beings. That's premise 1 as we talk about what we're talking about today. Premise 2 is this: moral injury is a spiritual issue. And I hope that Dr. Catterson talks about this, but clinicians have tried to figure out this moral injury piece and tried to put some science behind it. And there's science, don't get me wrong. But without spirituality, you don't have an answer for moral injury. That's what they're finding. And so if everybody is spiritual and moral injury is a spiritual issue, then that leads me to this. As the Chaplain Corps, we are uniquely qualified to discuss all things spiritual fitness and to combat the issues of moral injury. And we're the only ones in the Air Force that can do that. And so I'm thankful to invite my colleagues to whet our appetites on that. You're not gonna leave as experts, but hopefully they will whet your appetite and that you'll want to go out and you'll want to learn more as we figure out how we can speak to these issues. So if you can, welcome Dr. Catterson and Father Albertson.
Thanks, Mac. We were so sad to see him go, but we have Master Sergeant Ryder, who just came all the way out from the other coast, and so we've been double blessed, at least at SOCOM, to have 2 excellent SELs. Father Albertson and I, if we know anything about the psychology of education, we know it's 1:45, 1:50 in the afternoon. And so one of the things that we're going to do right now that we do all the time at SOCOM and at JSOU is basically it's going to give us an opportunity to read the room, because a lot of what we're going to talk about fits perfect with today's subject, which is trust. And so it's essential for you to be able to be an RST that's able to read a room really quick, and especially in the areas of spiritual fitness, the framework that we're going to talk about, the incredible heavy lifting that Chaplain Wharf has already done. That's both in the playbook and in the LOE workbook that has been given to you, but also in the area of moral injury. So in the meantime, I hope you're ready to stand up and sit down, but if you would stand up, if you talk to people in elevators, airplane stores, wherever you go, if that's you, you stand up right now. All right, have a seat. It's up and down real quick. All right, I need you to stand up if you write down a list of things to do and stick to it. Is that you? And guess what? There's another, what about on weekends? All right, have a seat. Stand up if you need to pick someone to race while driving. All right, and maybe it's the Beltway here in D.C., I'm not sure. How about this? Stand up if you seek out a familiar face at a big party. And I got to meet the boss's wife last night, and that's her area. Sit down. All right, and some chaplains, they actually get depressed if that's not them, but it's okay. You like a good cup of coffee or cappuccino? Yeah. All right. Now, how about this? You tend to be skeptical to giving some proof. All right. So I'm eyeing all the people that, Father Albertson, you better carry the freight. Have a seat. How about you trust your intuition? Two paths diverge in the woods, like Frost poem. All right. Have a seat. We're almost there. How about you clean your house or apartment before you can relax? Is that you? Look at that, hand went up and you're jumping. All right, have a seat. How about this one? Not your uniforms. You have a color-coded or otherwise organized closet. Is that you? All right, have a seat. You stand up if you're accused of asking too many questions. All right, have a seat. I was surprised Lucas stood up on that one, but it's all good. They stand up if you're accused of being too nice. All right, I'm looking for Kip and Doug. I don't see them. How about stand up if you're accused of not being nice enough? There you go. You figure out the plot of the movie before anyone else does. Is that you? Look at that. That was a double. That was like touchdowns up there. Last, but two more. Push the elevator button like I did today 14 times to remind that elevator that you're there. Have a seat. And last but not least, you did not care who won the Oscars. Matter of fact, the Navy pilots, they can't hold a candle to what we do in the Air Force or the Guardians. All right, have a seat.
Air power!
All right, there you go. All right, now here's the thing. What we're going to be talking to you about today, in just a second, Father Albertson, Chaplain Colonel Albertson, is going to be starting off with a story that's going to set the stage with the time that we have, because we got about 51 minutes. But at SOCOM, back in 2015, matter of fact, Doug Hess, Kip, they were part of our initiation class that we started down at SOCOM in 2015 and 16, where basically we did a gap analysis to say what was missing in soft PME for the RST. What was missing? We did in 15, 17, 19, 21, and we just finished it in 23 to say what are the things that are out there. And so in turn, everything that we had to do had to be research-based. It had to be scientifically validated. It had to be solution-focused. Best practice models. Matter of fact, it wasn't just like giving models, but it was students like Doug Hess. It was students like Lucas, who was one of our scholar SMEs the last few years that he's been down there. It's like we wanted them to create the models for the future of the RST. So best practice models, and could you globally scale it? And that's the reason I'm going to give about 3 or 4 plugs today for that playbook and the LOEs that both Chief Chaplain Kitchens as well as Chief Chambers. I get it right? I know you're right there, but I just want to make sure my glasses are working. But anyway, there you go. But in the meantime, I know that they're so passionate about it, but it has the opportunity to scale. But everything focused on what Mac just talked about, purpose, meaning, and value. So in the meantime, what I wanted to take the opportunity is just, Father, would you come and share this story? I found it to be powerful, and I'm going to move over, and then we're going to jump into it.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for letting us be a part of your program. Chaplain Kitchens, very honored to be here. Many thanks to my senior enlisted, prior Senior Master Sergeant McLean, and also for Dr. Caterson. And we're delighted to have Master Sergeant Ryder Select on our team as well. So we're really blessed. frankly, they make my job very, very easy. So, but sometimes it is helpful to have an illustration, all right? And one of the things that's very unique about the Chaplain Corps, but for anybody that serves in the military, is we do have unique and extraordinary experiences. We get to travel around the globe. We get to minister to a cross-section of Americana with the troops that are entrusted to us pastorally. And it is just a fantastic experience pastorally to be in this world. And a consequence of that, and I encourage you to kind of start categorizing some of your experiences, you end up getting some stories, right? And we always call them war stories. And of course, we know what the difference between a bedtime story and a war story is, right? So a bedtime story, once upon a time. A war story, no joke, there I was. Now this is the Chaplain Corps. The word joke can be substituted with other expletives, but for the sake of decorum, sir, we will not offer a selection of options. So anyway, I'll begin my story with a story about stories. So I'm downrange, and one of our guys was, it just so happened that his time to go back home for R&R was over the Thanksgiving holiday. And he was the oldest in his family, so his siblings were still in college and high school. And so he went home for Thanksgiving, and everybody wanted to know what was it like being deployed. So, well, he kept trying to steer the conversation to what's going on in their life, but it kept gravitating back to him. This was early on in the fight, and they wanted to hear his stories, the good, the bad, the sad, all that goes with it. And it just kept coming back to him. And so afterwards, he's out back having a cigar, a shot of cognac, and his uncle is there with him, and his uncle was like, man, those are some great stories. I just work at IBM, So, all right, I thought that might go over more humorously, but it obviously didn't. All right, so sometimes an illustration is helpful. You may have had experiences similar to this, but one of the counselings that I had, not just one like one of itself, solitary, but I've had a number of these, but this one was very dramatic. So one of our troops was having difficulty when I was at Fort Bragg, or Fort Belvoir, and we had served together downrange in Iraq, and he was still struggling with one of his experiences. So we sat down and we talked it out. But his experience was very dramatic, and I was familiar with it at the time because we served together, and I knew about these particular casualties. So it was a standard movement, one base camp to the other, convoy resupply. Many of you have probably been on missions like that, probably pulling security. There's an ambush. So the lead vehicle gets hit, classic, linear ambush. So the TTP was when you get hit like that, you immediately return fire. And so they were able to see the direction of the enemy fire, and they were able to take out some of the enemy in this ambush. But it went on for a little while. His vehicle also rolled over an ID. It was a smaller one, but the front right passenger side of the vehicle caught fire. So his best friend, who had been a chum of his throughout almost his whole career, was there, and the vehicle caught fire. So he's like, hey, man, you got to get me out of here. And meanwhile, they're taking fire. So there's rounds impacting the vehicle. And so the fire starts growing. And so he says, we're going to have to get over the console. Well, some of you remember, those consoles are quite large with all different radios. He's probably got another 80 pounds of gear on him with his IBA and ammunition. And so he tries to pull him over the console, but he can't do it. Meanwhile, the fire is getting worse. And so he makes a decision, I'm going to come around to the other side and try to open the door. The door had jammed. He couldn't get the door open because of the explosion. So he goes around to the front of the vehicle. Well, bing, 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 bing. The rounds are landing all around him. He's going to become a casualty. So he runs back around to the other side of the vehicle, and he's trying to pull him out of the vehicle one last time with all of his strength. Well, the flame is getting bigger, and at this point, his friend is screaming. He's, you got to get me out of here. You got to get me out of here. And he's doing the best he can. They're still under fire. He can't get him out of the vehicle. He tries one last time, but then that part of the vehicle just bursts into flame, and he can't get to him. And so the last thing he remembers is his friend reaching out, get me out of here! But the flames are too great. He can't get to the vehicle. And then a few seconds later, it kind of whole thing just catches fire, and he hears his friend screaming. Of course, it lasted only for a moment. So he's on the other side of the berm, and but then convoy commander comes over and says, hey, we're not out of this yet. Forget about him. You're sector fire. From your 11 o'clock to 2 o'clock, we are still taking fire from this enemy. And so he's got to disengage from that, and he gets right back into the fight. He's putting rounds towards the enemy. He tells me, I don't know if I hit anything or not. But he had to contend with that. Well, anyway, this is like 3 years later. And he is still living this every single day. And one can understand the impact and the trauma that's associated with something like that. This is not the typical experience that someone in the civilian sector is going to encounter. They may on occasion, but that could actually very much be the norm for us or something that we encounter regularly. But it articulates the feelings afterwards that bring out the reality of moral injury, the guilt. You know, he couldn't get to him. And though he did everything he could, there was nothing, you know, it's one of those catch-22s, a difficult situation where you cannot, even though you do your best, it still doesn't pan out for the good. And then, of course, afterwards, they had to secure the area because no fire stations. They had to wait till the vehicles burned out. And then they brought the vehicles and the remains in. And, of course, that had its own trauma with the mortuary affairs that had to do the separation of the vehicles and equipment from the personnel. But, you know, shame, guilt, anguish, anger, you know, at himself, at the enemy, at the situation. And these emotions were continuing to plague him day after day, year after year, till finally, you know, he finally came forward and said, I cannot undo and untangle this hole that's been drilled into my head and these images permanently placed there. So we're always trying to improve our skill set. That's the goal, to do the best that we can do for the troops that are entrusted to us and the privilege that we have in being able to meet those pastoral needs and the calling that we've responded to, that we believe God has called us to this. It's a very distinct and unique ministry. And it carries with it some of these unique challenges. So we're always trying to improve and get better at being able to do it. And we hope that our coverage today and the presentation will give you some refinement of the tools that many of you already have a lot of this. But we're constantly trying to sharpen our sword, improve our foxhole so that we can be the highest quality pastoral care provider and religious support asset that we can bring both to the command and to the troops. And so with that, I turn it back over to the good Dr. Caterson, and grateful for his contribution and presentation today. And we look forward to seeing you around the block for the rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Father. Just before we were walking in, Father Monaco was telling us that he's just new in the seat up at AFSOC, but he's going to be in Rome in October, and the subject that they're going to be looking at is moral injury, as they're meeting with their endorser. We brought 150 copies. I think they're all gone. We might have 2 or 3 that are tucked away in our bag. But we brought them up, and this is actually the culmination of about a 5-year project. And if you notice on the back of the monograph, this is what it says. Alexander Dumas is the author of The Count of Monte Cristo, but he also did a lot of writing and a lot of thoughts about trauma and about injustice. And so basically he concluded that moral wounds have this peculiarity about them. They may be hidden, but they never close. Always painful, always ready to bleed when touched. They remain fresh and open in the heart. And here's the thing. What we wanted to do is to take the opportunity to actually do a fresh study, and we simultaneously realized that we couldn't just do this for the special force enterprise, but we simultaneously started looking at what are the needs of the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Coast Guard, and now Guardians. So the work that we've been doing for a number of years is actually trying to think of moral injury, not just with SOF, Special Operations Forces, but also for big military. And so I'm going to just give about 30 seconds to talk about the courses that we built down there. I know, and I heard the presentation this morning. I'm so blessed at what's going to take place at the Chaplain School because I believe it's a new day. I think that you are actually going to continue to lead all the chaplain schools by the approach that you're taking. One of our students, Smees, Doug Lumpkin, is down there as the moral injury guy that came out of our program. But what we noticed in our gap analysis, one was ethical leadership advisement. And every one of the things that we wanted to do, we wanted to make sure that there was something that could go enterprise-wide, component-wise, or force-wide. So one of the things was the ethical battle drill that looks at the ethical decision-making The second course that we have looks at spiritual moral resiliency. And Doug and Kip will remember very early on when we were putting this thing together back in 15 and 16 that the goal was always to have this monograph that would come out, and it just took that long to do. We had a moral injury symposium back in 2019 at the hotel just across the street, and many of the white papers were white papers that were written by our student scholars that were coming out of the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy. And then we did one on spiritual care, looking at crisis care, and there's the suicide workbook that we put together that actually is a great complement to assist in those kind of things. I just give you that background because we're going to look at how these intersect. So this is really the breakdown of the chapters, and what I want you to notice that 2, 3, and 4 are the heart of everything that we've been trying to get at. At the end of the day, we're going to look at, there's going to be a distinction between looking at PTSD and moral injury. We're going to be looking at there is a continuum of moral dilemmas that move to moral injury. And then there's also a call for a reimagined PME, which is exactly what the Air Force Chaplain School is doing and has been doing for a while. So we're really, really excited about that. But our goal is not to make you morally injury experts or even the spiritual fitness framework experts today. We know there are many in the room. But what we wanted to do is actually, because some of you are new to the conversation, those that have been around a while, you would recognize that these are potentially morally injurious events, witnessing others violate a moral code, decisions that affect survival of others, unable to care for those that are harmed. You just go right down the list of acts of retribution, dehumanizing others, rape, torture, inability to prevent death and suffering. These are events that just simply being a warfighter could potentially bring about moral injury. Here's the bottom line. Moral injury is an invisible enemy. And you're going to notice that the 3 archetypes are right here. For moral injury in the military is simply, it all revolves around perception of being exposed to an event that's either you're looking at, you personally perpetrated it, which we would call commission, or you're witnessing it, that's omission, or you've been directed, mainly by a leader, all right, to violate your moral code. And at the end of the day, this perception is key because here's what we've discovered over the last 10 years, that we cannot tell an individual how they feel about the traumatic event that they've experienced and what it means to them. It is their experience, and they are the experts of their own individual wounds. And we call them soul wounds. And Father already just gave you a quick preview. The fact that guilt, shame, anger, disgust, these are all markers that move from way past PTSD to looking at moral injury. So here are the big takeaways. We're calling for, there has to be a shift in the paradigm. And that's the reason that people like Lucas who walked across the street, Doug Lumpkin walked across the street and said, listen, we got to work with the psychs. We got to work with the cognitions, the cognitive domain that's out there. We have to work with those that are doing PT. It's a team that has to do it. But in turn, we have to know our lane. Like Mac was saying, there's no one better equipped to answer the spiritual question, right, and the moral dilemma question, than the RST. So that's one of the things that we're going to do. And so many of you have seen this distinctions. Those that are new to the fight, there's these characteristics or markers, the difference between PTSD, everything from like a startle reflex to those that are moral injury that are specific to them. And then there's the ones that the overlap. So many of you have seen this. It's in the monograph. But here's something that's brand new that's actually coming out in the work that will be coming out in October. Chaplain Wharf will be one of the first ones to get it. We're coming out with a comprehensive book on moral injury in the military that's pulling together nearly 30 years of research. But here's the difference. You're looking at PTSD is looking at a threat to personal well-being. Let me slow down. Traumatic violation of personal values. You notice what Mac was talking about the values part when we started off? Based on fear and adrenaline is PTSD versus based on morals and ethics. And we've quantified this scientifically. Physical and psychological wound versus a spiritual or a soul wound can result in moral injury is a precursor to PTSD 95% of the time is what we've tracked. So in turn, if you take an MRI, this is the new science that's actually in your playbook. If you look at some of this stuff, I don't expect you to do a deep dive on this, but this is the bottom line is empirically there's a difference in the brain between moral injury and PTSD. If you're going to notice that moral injury is the surface of the brain. It's that higher cognitive functioning. make sense of your morals and your ethics and everything. Your values have been all, jacked up. Versus PTSD is really the inner brain, that fight or flight. So this is, and that's actually in the second chapter of the monograph. Here's another big thing, is looking at that there's a continuum that looks at the relationship between moral and ethical decision-making and moving to moral drift and then eventually moral injury. So in turn, I show this storyboard because this came somewhere between Doug and Kip's class and Lucas's class down at JSOU. This was actually an Air Force chaplain that was embedded with the team in a continent, which I won't name, but you could probably look at the picture. And it is actually the second battle drill that's in our ethic battle drills thing. It's called intervention. And what took place was they were part of an augmented team. They're watching a nation that's not a partner nation in the middle of this continent, in the city square, gang raping a girl. And our snipers had beads on them and could take them out. They asked permission to engage. They were told, you cannot take that shot. They appealed to the chaplain, who was one of the students in our class, was Doug Lumpkin. It wasn't Doug, but it was one of his colleagues. They asked him to intervene for us, and he was told by the person in command, chap, shut your mouth. We're standing down. We're not taking the shot. We will not blow the mission. Next day, 06, they got up. They rescued the 100 girls. It makes it to CNN. But on the way back, they called me unsecured on the phone because I was his professor, cursing me out and cursing him out, saying, we could have taken the shot and still saved the girls. What are you teaching down at that school? I said, call me back when you're secure, stateside. And we came and we actually unpacked that. And it was going to be a 30-minute back brief. And it turned out to be like an entire day of trying to look at this scenario. So basically what you're looking at is you have ethical decisions that need to be made. There's character challenges that cause a moral dilemma for you. And this isn't just soft specific. This is, as you know, you're talking about people in the middle of the country, Canon, right, that are actually looking at little monitors and making decisions about things that are going out tens of thousands of miles away, or our ST guys that are there, or our PJs that are doing this stuff. And it's like, so what happens is there's this continuum from a moral dilemma that can quickly move to moral drift over time that will lead to moral injury. So it's moral drift. It's like when you tie a boat up, but loosely, and it starts to fade away over the night. And it's like now it's out in the middle of the lake or the middle of the river or the middle of the ocean. It's out there. That's the gradual ebbing of standards. What is moral injury? It is suffering in a high-stakes situation, and they lead to each other naturally. In turn, we develop this ethical decision-making. We're not going to do a deep dive. We spent a whole day, as Lucas could tell you, down at the school just looking at this with our team. But in the meantime, it doesn't take rocket science to figure this out. You're looking at about X and Y axis type of thing. You're looking at positive outcomes and negative outcomes. You're looking where there's low moral drift, or you're looking at where there's high moral drift. And so what's the base case scenario? Just doing our job. There's a positive outcome, there's low moral drift, we're just doing our job, and basically we're like, yeah, it's the best case. Then you're looking at what happens is actually all of a sudden there's low moral drift, but there's a negative outcome. So what do we do? What do we do in the military? We retrain. Right? We're going to retrain. We're saying it's unfortunate, cost of doing business. We're going to retrain. What's worst case scenario? It's red, the red quadrant. Well, what's going on there? At the end of the day, that's the CNN moment. It's basically busted, makes the news, makes SOF or makes the Air Force or the Guardians look bad, right? At the end of the day, you go, but watch what the issue is. The moral dilemma continuum as it relates to spiritual fitness framework and moral injury is the yellow quadrant. Because look what it is. Basically, it's a positive outcome, but there's high moral drift. And what is it? It's like it's the culture getting away with it. It's like, if you ain't cheating, you ain't trying. And so we actually train people to actually live into that yellow quadrant. And that's what the issue is. So when we're looking at the whole continuum of ethical decision-making and moving all the way to moral drift or these traumatic experiences that were described, it's like so often this is a result of it. Another big takeaway is that there has to be a reimagined PME. The way that we've done it for years has not been working. So in turn, it's not like giving you a new set of eyes, but it's giving you a new set of lenses. It's not just new landscapes, but how can you look at a problem? as we can tell you in the courses, what they're going to do with the Air Force Chaplain School. They can write about it, they can blog about it, they can write papers about it, they can have discussion groups, but they're never going to get at the issue. But guess what? Just like if you show a picture, though, that's my picture. That's one of my big pieces of moral injury, right? Do you know where you were at 8:52 on 9/11? That's my seat right there. That's seat 8A on Flight 78, Newark International Airport. Went to the airport that morning with my best friend, golf partner, recruited him out of Wheaton College. His name was Todd Beamer. Eventually, he said the Lord's Prayer, 23rd Psalm with a GTE operator, Jefferson, to touch base with his wife, and he said, ready, let's roll. And they took the cockpit on Flight 93 and downed the plane in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. But in the meantime, for me, that was traumatic because it was the pilot that said there's an unconfirmed report. A plane just hit the Trade Center. You can disembark immediately. I got out just in time to see the second plane slam at Tower 2, made my way to Lisa Beamer's house and to my church, where I set up a command center to figure out who else was missing. My friend Fred, he lost 66 people on 104 Tower 2. I spent 75 days at ground zero, becoming guilty, feeling guilty, and eventually suicidal. And my bride and Lisa put me on a plane on New Year's Day that following year and said, don't come home till you actually deal with this. And that became the foundation for comprehensive airman fitness and comprehensive soldier fitness. But that picture is the thing that triggers me. And so in the meantime, that's like all the trauma that goes into it. So in turn, how do we do that when you're trying to do this? Is you actually give them a piece of paper, you give them a napkin. This is a whiteboard, and those that have been at JSOU recognize it's a 12-foot whiteboard. And this was done by Air Force, an air commando that was actually deployed, and basically you're looking at the triggers. So by drawing a picture, they're like, okay, maybe I can get a handle on it. Sometimes it's this, the cover of the monograph. That's the original drawing that happens to be on your left-hand side. On the right-hand side is an AI rendering of it. But basically this was an E8. Came back, and that you're looking at when you went to the Traumatic Brain Institute there at Walter Reed. That's the Black Hawk that went down, where he lost all his best buddies. They're friendlies that they killed by accident. That's him in the desert in the Middle East crying out, if there's a God, take my life. Pieces of the puzzle trying to put together. And then the frontal cortex that's there where his life is still scrambled and a mess. But this was the first start to him actually moving through with his healing. So as we're looking at it, here's another model where we use Legos. I remember the first time I brought Legos to the Pentagon, and Cecil Richardson, Admiral Burton, Doug Carver were all together, and they go, what is this guy doing? And I'm like, we're going to use some Legos today, and we're going to use some Play-Doh, and we're going to actually look at some of the stuff that we haven't talked about for the last 10 years. Let's kind of deal with it. But through it, they're able to actually start the healing process. So it's a new way of actually looking at it. There's a lot of takeaways that come through it, but from the research. But here it is: guilt and shame will lead to suicide. Right? You're talking about 9 out of 10 times if you don't treat it. But there are some of the other things that are there. I want to show you the typology research that's going to come out in November. You don't need too many words. You're like, that's a lot of words, right? You're looking at too many words. But look at the bottom. That's what's important. 1,000 interviews, 650 plus case studies, and 200 plus storyboard cases that actually goes together, put together a new typology for moral injury in the military. And it basically, you got 3 archetypes, now there's 6 super types. And I'm just going to show you what they look like because we want to get to the spiritual fitness stuff. Number one is failure of leadership. Hands down, number one thing in moral injury. And there's these 4 subcategories that go underneath it. And all this stuff will be made available to you through Chaplain Wharf and Chaplain Kitchens, as well as Chief. She's going to make sure that you have all the tools that you need. But this is failure of leadership. There's another one called deficiency and defectiveness. And actually there's 4 other subcategories. One of them is justice versus mercy. Unqualified suffering. Right? So this is stuff that, again, through 1,000 plus case studies and storyboards, we've actually been able to figure these out. There's another one, destruction of faith and hope. Right? Some of them goes back to August last year, right? When you're looking at abandonment and some of the stuff that goes on when we're pulling out. We tracked 72 different cases that actually we were able to document just from what took place a year ago this month, right? So you're looking at destruction of innocent and loyalty, right? So everything from military sexual trauma to promise breaking to atrocities. So that's another big category. Death is one. And it's not just like death. If I can I go back? I don't know. There it is. You're looking at dehumanizing or actually survivor's guilt. That's a huge one. That's huge, right? And then last is unintentional destruction. And right, this is your wheelhouse. Look at this. Right? You're talking like remote drones, right? So we got someone who's actually working on his doctorate right now, just doing a deep dive in all the stuff that actually works, if that stuff that happens in the middle of the country. There's a how to identify, how to intervene, how to integrate, training that's being put together. So we're looking at solution-focused things, and the last thing I wanted to show you is on the bottom is the chaplain or the RST help them find their sources of healing. And that the airman or the guardian are able to choose what sources to investigate. So that's part of what's going to be on the training. But this is what's in your playbook, which is absolutely amazing. You have both you got the read-aheads that were sent ahead. You're looking at fortifying the warfighter playbook and the commander's toolkit. They're both in here, and Chaplain Worf actually looked at it. But the way that we started out was looking at it purpose, meaning, and value. And so this is something that I saw Cecil Richardson did at our PWOC conference back a decade ago, but he did a reboot on what General George Marshall said. An airman's heart is the airman's spirit, the airman's soul are everything. Unless the airman's soul sustains them, they cannot be relied on and will fail themselves, their commander, and the country in the end. The bottom line is, how do you sustain one's soul? And so the domains of the human spirit, this is where we reach across with the psychs. And we're saying, okay, we're talking about spiritual core in the middle, but we're looking at language that they understand. Self-agency, self-actualization, self-regulation, understanding that stuff. And that led into what I wanted to show you is this incredible video that we actually just edited last week again. Our good friend who's been a friend of the Chaplain Corps, Chaplain Kitchens would attest to this. Is Dr. Lisa Miller, and she's helped us put together. And we've condensed down a longer video, but this is the heartbeat of what you're gonna find in your playbook when you're looking at the spiritual core. So I'm gonna hit it, and we'll make sure we have the proper sound. I think it should go.
My name is Dr. Lisa Miller. I'm a professor at Columbia University Teachers College, where I founded the Spirituality Mind-Body Institute. I've been teaching and doing science as an investigator for 20 years, actually now closer to 25. I wrote the book, The Spiritual Child. It's based on 20 years of peer-reviewed science showing spirituality to be an innate human capacity, which, if supported and realized, is the strongest protective factor against the most prevalent forms of suffering in children and adolescents, even up into young adulthood. So many years ago, I was really chewing on a scientific problem. I'd noticed that spirituality was highly protective against depression in mothers and in fathers. And I could see a trace in the data that in young children coming of age, early teens, spirituality was a source of resilience. Protected against anxiety, it had some benefits against depression in the pre-adolescent child. But I sensed there was more in the data. Sometimes you can feel in the data the pulse, the life. There's a story looking to emerge. The first time ever, we now have young adults who never benefited from the intergenerational transmission of spiritual and religious life. We now have young adults who never benefited from the grandmother on the subway, if you will. And what we find is a terrible loss. The formation of the spiritual core simply has not happened among a great number of young adults. And left without a spiritual core, strong peer review epidemiological evidence shows us that young adults without a strong personal spirituality are 80% more likely to become addicted, 60% more likely to have major depression, 70% more likely to take risks such as driving fast, jumping off high places, having unwanted relations. And into the epidemic of our time, the young adult with no spiritual bearings at all is 50% more likely to face suicidality. The epidemics of our time, depression, addiction, suicidality, go hand in hand with the sharp slide in religious life. Put another way, with the deep slide in religious life in the American family has become the sharp incline in the suffering of the child and the young adult. Epidemic rates of depression, addiction, and even suicidality. Death by suicide now rivals the rate of death by auto accidents in high school. And even in the past 2 years, this epidemic has pushed down to middle school, such that the middle school child is now equally likely to die by suicide as he or she is to die by auto accidents. Every single one of us is born with an innate capacity for spiritual life. To what extent? About 1/3 heritable, 2/3 socialized. This means that every single one of us is born a spiritual child. Every single one of us is a cognitive being, an emotional being, a physical being, and clearly, the science indicates, a spiritual being. When the 2/3 socialized is realized, perhaps through the embrace of a religious faith tradition, perhaps through the ways of our family, community, chaplaincy, teachers, then the spiritual core is formed, by which is meant a deep way of being, through which we perceive love and connection with fellow human beings, with our planet, and feel a deep sense of guidance and connection with a transcendent, ultimate presence. We might say God, Allah, Hashem, the universe. Our spiritual core is a capacity, an innate capacity, that allows us to feel a deep sense of connection, love, and guidance. It is our capacity for a transcendent, loving, guiding relationship.
Let me just give you those stats again. I rarely write things down and have them with me when I'm presenting, but this was so important. Actually, I had one of the chaplains snap a picture at lunch. Without the spiritual core, the science and the research has showed that 80% greater chance of addictions, 70% greater chance of risk, high-risk behaviors, 60% greater chance of depression, 50% greater chance of suicidality. But with a spiritual core, it is highly protective in both adolescents and young adults. And so what we don't want to miss is the fact that she said 2/3 socialize. So in turn, the RST is absolutely essential. And so we've put this together so that, and you're going to see this in the playbook, when you have developmental tasks, everything from self to actually relationships to existential reality, good events, bad events, you look at with a spiritual core versus without a spiritual core. And so as you're looking at the purpose, the path, the people, and the practices that are laid out for you in your playbook, I applaud the chief of chaplains and the chief for actually having the foresight to say, they're not going to tell you how to do it, but they're going to just say, hey, now why don't you take this and use this as a framework. That's why I love that they're calling it a spiritual framework. And the Air Force Chaplain Corps is actually a couple steps ahead of everybody right now. I mean, we piloted this with 1st Special Forces Group, but there's change in leadership, and so in the meantime, it's great that at this summit that it's being introduced. But you're going to find in your playbook, you're going to find looking at spiritual reflection from both purpose and pathway. So the question, what give my life meaning or purpose? I mean, RST could run with that. Or what is my spiritual path of faith, belief, and my worldview? And these other questions that are below those. This is a game changer for you if you incorporate this into your ruck, into your slide deck. Practices, what are the most effective spiritual practices is the question, but there's a whole bunch of other ones that follow under it. But here's the key, people. To whom am I most feel spiritually connected to? That connection is the thing that the RST can do that actually can lead the charge. So here's basically 5 deep questions. You could just start there. At the end of your life, what do you want people to say about you? And then there's the other ones that follow suit. If you only get one set of questions, and I'm holding just a second because I know some people are snapping, but this is one that we use all the time. When our co-authors on the monograph is probably the leading virtual ethicist in the world, Dr. M.C. Egerson. And Dr. Dave Wood is the lead psych for 19th Special Forces Group, and he actually is the one who does all the protocols for selection for Special Forces across all the components. But at the heart of it, when we just get one shot, we basically do this one deep question that is actually in 3 parts, is that if I let this thought, this emotion, govern my behavior, will it lead me to live the life that I want to live, be the person I want to be, or stand for what I want to be known? This, just starting with this, actually opens the door for questions. You're going to find in your playbook, it's going to give you the points of looking, 4 points that move you across the playing field for looking at towards purpose, so following your path. You're going to see that it's going to have more things that are under there that are all in your slide deck. It's going to give you tools. There's going to be another thing that we're going to be talking about, which I loved on the moleskin that was given out there, is to actually start writing your story, share your story. So much what we do is we actually have people do a storybook, not just a storyboard, but a storybook. And as you just look at that, what do you see right here? Just call out. What, in this little story, what are some of the things that you see? Real loud. Got it? Okay, what else? Okay. Anything else? I mean, you're looking at family, you look at graduation, piggy banks, you're looking at marketing things, you're looking at that flight. This was actually done by someone who had 5 deployments in 6 years, right? So it was like his daughter said, Daddy, you're always on a plane. When are you coming home? So basically, this was one of the things that we do to kind of unpack it. Looking at your soul and what is your soul goal. And so there's all these things that are going to be in your playbook and stuff that you can use in that framework that'll be very, very helpful for you of looking at practices and stuff. So we're not going to get a deep dive, but we wanted to show you that people are important. So who are the trusted people? Today's theme is trust. Who are the people that you share purpose with? Who are the groups that you share purpose with? And what are the agencies that you share purpose with? This is living out your purpose. And so this is actually part of that framework that actually can set you up in the RST for success. So we go back to the way of spiritual fitness is looking at meaning, purpose, and value and practices. And this is the way that we do it in a joint environment where we're looking at practices as actually the thing that we do all the time and looking at meaning, purpose, and value. So our desire is not to make you experts today, but what we wanted to do is just let you know that you are ahead of the curve. Thank God for Chief Chaplains and for Chief that actually have had the insight. And I want to highly encourage you that the stuff that you're going to be getting is actually, it is best practice. It's research-based. It's been scientifically validated. It's like, why not use that? Because you have to be at the table. One of the learnings we had for ethical leadership advisement is that by Congress, by mandate, you're the spiritual and ethical advisors of the commander. And so when you go to him or go to her, right, it's their spiritual program. But so often they need the RST to step in and say, sir, ma'am, we want to come alongside you and help you with your spiritual program. This is actually it's going to be a game changer here at this wing, here at this aspect of Space Command. And if you can step into that space, but you have the science that goes behind it on purpose, meaning, value, it's going to be a game changer. Now, we do have the perfect amount of time. Mac's going to come and he's going to actually kind of tie a bow to make sure that it makes sense. And then thank you, Chaplain, because I know that you got a few questions. In the meantime, our goal was not to make you the experts. Some of you could have been on stage instead of Father and I or Mac, but in the meantime, we wanted to let you know that we are just so thankful at SOCOM that you actually are leading the way among the services of actually saying, we're going to take charge of this. That's the reason I love that back in the day, General Schleif was going to say, we own, right? Chaplain Duncan, he said, we're going to own moral injury. We got this thing. The Chaplain Corps, the RST's got this thing. We're going to own spirituality and spiritual fitness. And now the fact that your team here is giving you a framework, I mean, it's going to be a game changer. We're just so encouraged, aren't you, Father? Matt, come and actually tie this thing together for us. Woo.
Take a breath. We witnessed a miracle, did we not, Chaplain Niglish? Like, that is 9 months of curriculum, and I told Chaplain Niglish, like, this could be a miracle if he gets done in an hour for Father, ANJE, and me to get up there. That was a miracle. That proves right there, man, that's a lot of info. And so Chaplain Kitchens came up to me last night, and he's like, hey, you're going to talk tomorrow. And I was like, no, I learned you step aside when there's smarter people, right? Like, I've been taught that. He's like, no, you're going to talk. I was like, well, Chaplain Kitchens, what do you want me to say? He said, well, share your testimony. And I was like, that's the most Chaplain thing I've ever heard in my life. Share my testimony. So I'll share my testimony, right? For 14, 15 years, I lived a pretty protected Air Force life. I was in AETC for all that time, and that's not to say there's not crisis in AETC. There absolutely is, especially when you work with students, but it wasn't a part of the culture. And I stepped into an organization that's very near and dear to me now, but it was still grieving the loss of their warriors. Whether it be a training accident where 2 members collided and they both died on impact, or they died downrange and their families were still grieving and the unit was still picking up the pieces. And they wrestled with these things and we didn't have answers. We came alongside them the best we could and we walked with them. We ministered to them. And when I say we, I do mean we, because as enlisted people, you have a part in this, right? This is not a chaplain issue. This is a religious support team, chaplain corps issue. It's whole of team, right? And we were reactive more often than when we were proactive. And we made it work, right? And then I get down to Special Operations Command. My second most favorite assignment. Now it's USAFEF Africa SEL, right? Yeah. And we faced a whole different issue as we began pulling out of downrange and shifting our focus to near peer, which is absolutely important. But we faced a community that wrestled with purpose, meaning, and value. If the spotlight doesn't shine on me and my entire identity is wrapped into my profession and now my profession is no longer highlighted as the most important thing that we do, who am I? Well, when people are wrestling with those issues, you face discipline issues. You face people who aren't motivated to come to work. You face more prevalence for moral injury. And so we were reactive in that. And that's why as Chaplain Kitchens joined with us and we began talking through this, at first, I'll be honest, I was against the term spiritual fitness. I was like, that's kind of corny. I mean, other people have used it. But as I thought about it more, I don't think you could pick a better word than spiritual fitness. Why? Because fitness implies that you're being proactive. And for so long, we've been reactive. If you think that it only happens in special operations, you're wrong. Watch the news. What's going on in Africa right now? What's going on in Europe right now? And I'm on those 2 continents focused because that's what I'm reading, but it's happening everywhere. What's going on in Hawaii right now? What's going on in South America? I hope you watch the news because that's what impacts our people, right? And see what's going on. But crisis is everywhere. And so moral injury is very real. Spirituality and the issues going on there are very real. And we can speak to that. It's about being proactive, spiritual fitness. You know, I've been going to the gym for probably 20 years now. You can tell, right? Like I'm looking big. It's because I don't have a plan. I go in there and I'm like, yeah, I guess I need to probably work on arms today. I'll work on arms and I'll hit arms again in 3 months, right? Like I don't ever have a plan. Right? No, nobody does that, right? You develop a plan. You develop an approach. If you went to the nutritionist and they were like, just eat whatever makes you happy, figure it out along the way. I mean, you'll figure it out as you go, right? Like, we wouldn't employ a nutritionist, right? Same thing with mental health. But yet, spirituality has been that one domain where we've been like, it's very personal, I mean, everybody's kind of got their own thing, so, we haven't really planned it. We haven't talked with our members about that, but we can. So that's what spiritual fitness is about. How do we come alongside people, walk with them, and help them develop a proactive approach to fortifying their spirituality? We can do that, and we should be doing that. Because as we develop their spirituality, we're going to find that they are less prone to things like moral injury, to things like PTSD, right? So that's my testimony, sir. I had to learn the hard way the value of being proactive in regards to spirituality, but I would ask that you not be that way. And so as we talk readiness, it's about being ready. That's what spiritual fitness is about. It's about being ready. So with that, I'll close on that, and I think we got 5 minutes for questions for Dr. Catterson as I step aside.
That's another round of applause. Thank you. So we have a couple of minutes for some questions. That was outstanding. I hope you enjoyed that. For any one of you that have come into us, as we kind of think about integrated resiliency partnerships, I've heard you talk a lot about that today. So in what ways have you seen the integration of faith and spirituality positively impact the overall readiness of our Air and Space Force professionals? So as you think about the integration of holistic fitness and that concept, how have you seen that result in people's lives, making them better, more fit and ready?
Yeah. So down at JSOU, we have the Senior Enlisted Academy, right, which is my favorite place actually to go. I mean, I shouldn't say this out loud, sir, because Chaplain Albertson's like, oh, but we got you there to do the graduate school for the. No, I love going to the Senior Enlisted Academy because a lot of times, you know, we have our PJs or our ST people that are down there are now our guardians that are coming down there, and so when we have this conversation, right, we let them tell their stories of how it's integrating. And so I think that's going to be the biggest thing is to listen. The RST has to ask the questions to get people talking, right? Get them to draw the pictures, do the little storyboard, do all that kind of stuff. And here's the other thing, at least in our community, but I know it's the case with all that the Guardians in the Air Force do, actually more than probably any other component. But people, again, they're like, well, they're not going to do Legos and stuff like that. You wouldn't believe the intricacy of stuff. I'm going, what in the world is that? Well, tell me that story. And how are you integrating that into your life? And so that's what I've seen is to listening to their stories. We've had many of them. I didn't want to highlight one of them because maybe Mac or Father would have them. But I think that's a biggie is to get them to tell their stories, and you're going to see that you can connect the dots. Because I've had actually commanders down there. Literally, I mean, going back a number of years ago, 7 years ago when we were first down there, and there was actually a commander. I mean, he had more stars than you, and he basically, well, that's my wife's department, right? It's spirituality kind of thing. And it was and it got back to her because I saw her later on, and she goes, "Did he really say that?" He's like, "You better help him learn to integrate more." And I go, "He's a 3-star. I'm not going to help him integrate anything. But in the meantime, maybe you can." He's like, so we started doing that. We had a conversation at lunch today where we were on the island of Hawaii. And again, it was a 2-star and his bride, and we were doing an exercise where they could tell their stories and do stuff. And you're supposed to be chair to chair, knee to knee, and his chair was like that. And she goes. They normally call me JE when they want me to do something where I can get fired, not Doc. So JE, can you help me? So I went over and moved his chair. And I said, "Is knee to knee, sir?" Right? And look in her eyes, tell her story. And she wants to talk about how she wants to integrate some of this stuff into your family with your teenagers. And so that's all that I'd have to say, sir.
I was just going to add to it. Many of you are aware of the 5 Ws that come across the blotter. We've had an enormous spike in people coming forward suffering from suicidal ideation.
That's right.
So that is a definitive trend that I've not seen before. I think that is a compliment to the Chaplain Corps as a whole because of our approachability. And then I would add to that, like the case I'd shared with you earlier, the willingness of someone to finally come forward and say, "I'm not able to get over this." So the fact that they're now starting to come forward, and I think as a whole we're going to see more of that as we're out of combat for a while. Some of these things have been brewing for a while, and a change of mission, they're going to realize there's some inhibitors that they can make progress on if they just reach out. So the reaching out, I think, is the critical identifier that what we're doing is working.
Awesome. Well, that was great. Do you have anything to offer? Okay. So we got time for one more question, and I think it goes nicely with where we're at. So how do you see AC teams coming alongside our integrated resilience partners to fortify holistic wellness and readiness? Obviously, it's not just one team, right? We're a part of an integrated resilience community. So how can HC teams start to build those relationships with the other integrated partners that we serve alongside?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I saw the red sign, and so I will keep it brief, right? Everybody's got to use the bathroom. Here's what it boils down to, okay? Everybody wants to fight for territory. We got to stop, right? Like, and this is what I teach our classes at JSOU, right? Like, it's not us against the psychs. It's not the psychs against us. It's not us against anybody. We've been focusing on the wrong thing all along if it's us against anybody else because we're focused internally if that's what we're fighting for, right? If it's about the member, we should be able to join hands with each other and try to do what's best for the member. And sometimes that means we're not the answer, okay? Sometimes that means somebody else is the better answer. But sometimes that does mean that we are the better answer. And so when we talk and we collaborate with our partners for the betterment of that airman, then we're focused on the right things. And you don't have to worry about that, sir, because we're focused on the right thing.
Awesome.
All right.
Boom.
Great.